discussion, again with Sophie PEDDER, Paris Bureau Chief of The Economist, who will be talking to Stephen MAIJOOR, who's the Chair of the European Securities Market Authority, and Robert OPHELE, Chairman of l'Autorité des marchés financiers, the French Financial Markets Authority. Please welcome them to the stage.
Thank you. Me again. Right. Well, welcome to the two guests for the Fireside Chat. We're going to talk about the Capital Markets Union and try and dig a little bit more into some of the questions, the points that were raised earlier. When you look back at the Commission's first action plan for the Capital Markets Union in 2015, the ambition was to complete it by 2019. Now we've got a new action plan released by the Commission in September with 16 priorities. I don't know if you can have 16 priorities, but anyway, there are 16 bits to the plan. Let's look at these and look at the Commission's objectives. Perhaps I can start with Robert OPHELE. Is the focus right? And if not, what should the priorities be?
No, I should say I very welcome this action plan. It's an ambitious plan both by the issues covered and by the timetable proposed. Ambitious by the issues covered since it tackles very sensitive issues such as taxation, insolvency regime, supervision, and we know that these issues are very sensitive. And it's also ambitious by its timetable, since much of the actions are supposed to be underway at the end of next year. But I think we should, you have mentioned 16 priorities, 16 actions, actually. We should look at this action plan as a global one, presenting indeed 16 actions. But that doesn't mean that you could embark in a piecemeal approach. It's not a menu when you will have to pick up one or of the others. It should be implemented. All of them need to be implemented. And in order to do that, there will be a need for a very strong political backing, because without that, it will be the same thing that last time, meaning a very good action plan, but at the end of the day, or at the end of the 5 years, almost nothing. We will have the opportunity to come back to some of these actions, because some of them are clearly in the remit of financial supervisors, and I will just mention 2 of them because perhaps we will have the opportunity to come back to them. It's the idea that we should foster equity financing. That's one of the key points. And the other, we will also need to improve supervision, which is clearly in our perimeter. But perhaps we'll do that later.
Oh, well, perhaps you can elaborate right away, and then we'll move on to hear from Stephen MAIJOOR in a second. Can you elaborate on those 2 points? What is it that makes them the priority, and in what ways are they perhaps most likely to contribute to achieving the objective?
Fostering equity financing is quite a challenge in view of the very accommodative monetary policy environment, fostering leverage and debt. But we all know that we need a balanced mix of financing. Without that, we will never develop innovation. We will never develop stability in the financial system. So it's at the heart of this plan, and it's right to do so. In that perspective, let me just emphasize that often we are trying to highlight how SMEs are important. SMEs are very important indeed, but I'm not sure that the listing is for SMEs the ultimate way for all of them to finance the development. The world has changed. I think that they come to the public market now at a later stage in the development, and if we need to encourage this these listings at an early stage, we do not need to miss the idea that private equity and larger capitalization are keys in that field. And so I could elaborate on that if you want, but on both of them, what we could do for SMEs and what we should do for private equity and large caps. And but that's something I think there is a need to have a balanced view, and the narrative should not just highlight the SMEs case. And for supervision, it's what is very interesting in the action plan is at some point, that was the case last few years when we discussed how foster enhanced supervision in the EU. There was just the idea to develop direct supervision by ESMA. Then the idea was try to foster harmonization by discussing between the 27 supervisor and the ESMA. And now that's the right way to handle this issue, is to start by harmonizing the regulation, because you will never have the possibility to have an efficient supervisor with 27 different regulations. And that's what we have right now with the directives. And that's a key point, and that's the right way to address the issue.
I want to get back to regulation in a moment, but perhaps I can turn to you, Stephen, and ask a little bit about how well you think the action plan addresses the needs of retail investors, and perhaps especially those who are not particularly financially literate or don't know quite how these things work. What's your view on that point in particular?
Thank you very much, Sophie, for that question, and many thanks also to Perry Europlus for inviting me. It's really good to see you here in real. We have been Zooming and WebExing many hours, and it's really very good, despite all the complexities of doing this in COVID-19 times, to really see you in person. A couple of comments on the Capital Markets Union. I think it is true that it started in the Capital Markets Union term was started in 2015. The reality, of course, is that Europe has been trying to integrate European capital markets already for 2-3 decades, and it is a process which is, in that sense, an evolution and progressing over time. And of course, I would have preferred that it would have gone faster, but in all fairness, there were steps were taken in the last period since it was launched in 2015. One of the, Sophie referred to the fact, how can you have 16 priorities? Capital markets are very heterogeneous. They're not as homogeneous as banking, and so automatically it will always be a longer laundry list of changes that need to take place. And I think where I am especially very glad about, and what has made it into this report, but also into the CMU next report, which, by the way, was an initiative started with the French and the Dutch, is the strong focus, let's say, on the retail investor, on households. One of the lessons you can see from those countries that have a thriving capital market is there is a clear link between households and a thriving capital market. So somehow you need to engage retail investors, households into the capital market. You cannot have a successful capital market if everybody saves through deposits. You can see it in Sweden, the UK, and the US. These are all countries with a strong link through the pension systems or directly investing in the capital markets. Obviously, that is also needed for households to get a reasonable return on their savings. The other side of this, of course, it's not only to the benefit of retail investors and households, it also goes back to the point made by Robert. It is around equity financing. We know that the European economy was already indebted before the COVID-19 crisis. To understandably cover up the losses in revenues That has been now addressed with more debt, and you can see the debt levels are further increasing of the European economy, and obviously private sector. And obviously that is a problem. It's a problem from a stability perspective, but also because we know is that equity financing is a type of financing which really stimulates innovation. More innovative economic activities require equity. It is to have their debt funding, and debt financing is not the best and the most appropriate way to do it. Maybe finally, very quickly, what are the priorities of the 16 that are relevant here? How do you make this change in terms of getting the households into the capital markets? So this varies from financial literacy. This is around pension systems, but it's also about making sure that financial products are understandable and that we improve the information on financial products. Finally, maybe on another priority that I would like to mention is the one on the access, the single access to the set of information in Europe, to access financial and non-financial information of corporates. I think that is another very good part of the priorities.
Thank you very much. Let's now talk about regulation and the role of the regulators. If we can come back to Robert OPHELE. What's the game changer here? What can Europe deliver? And in a way, I think I'd quite like to know, how do we make sure that rules converge? You know, should we actually have more centralized powers in order to deal with this particular crisis?
The first step is not to centralize power. The first step is to have a single rule book. And we do not have right now this single rule book. That's absolutely key. If you have not regulation but directives with small harmonization at the end of the day, you have too many national options. And I remember when I joined the SSM board at the beginning, the first issue we have to deal with was the number of national options. How could you supervise on a centralized basis something which is different from one country to another? That's the first point. And then single rule book, harmonized regulation, harmonized supervision, or single supervision in some cases, depending on the issue at stake. And at the end of the day, you also need to have an harmonized enforcement, which is also a difficult issue to tackle with. And you know that. If I may just have a word on retail, because you have mentioned that, and it's very important, because we do not have to enrich the rich, empower the powerful, and there is a risk there. And associating retails is very key in order to avoid that. And it's possible, even in private equity, for example. And there are some cases in France. I want to mention that because it's something which is very important in our view. Could be done through some scheme for life insurance. Could be done by fund of funds, and we have some new products which are now or will be in a few days on the market, especially, for example, by BPI investment. That's something which is very important in that respect, not to associate a lot of people to the development of the economy, and to avoid having them just looking for safe, liquid, and not remunerated assets.
Thank you very much. Stephen, time is flying. We've fireside chats are very quick things these days. Perhaps you could just answer one question on regulation, and that's about, to what extent do you think that the revision in the amount of financial regulation could facilitate a more competitive EU financial market, or do you actually think that the single rule book has to can't be diluted in any way?
So a few points on, and I will try to be as short as possible. I can see the time ticking away. The point made by Robert obviously is very valid. We need to go to more regulations instead of directives, and that will try to really go to a single rule book. Second point, I think as Europeans we have the tendency to make our rules very detailed, and be a bit weaker on supervision and enforcement. I say it very blunt. And I would say let's focus, if there is a problem, not on additional rule, but focus on what could we have achieved with supervision, what could we have achieved with enforcement, make sure that supervision across Europe is consistent and that it's also effective. On the issue of competitiveness, obviously with the regulator, there's always this idea, less rules means less investor protection. The reality is that in some areas of European financial rules, we have made it so complex, it's neither to the benefit of the industry, clearly not, but also not to the benefit of the retail investor, and it's not about protection. Clear example, PRIPS, the original PRIPS that we still have, should be improved, should be simpler, should be more effective. The other example, and Robert is very much aware of this, bond market transparency. We have written hundreds of pages on bond market transparency. How many bonds actually increased by coming under this transparency requirement? None. There was no improvement there. And so we can simplify the rule book. And of course, I will be very careful as a regulator to say it should not go against investor protection. But I think improvements can be made without violating investor protection.
Brilliant. 15 seconds left.
I could make one more point.
I think we're 15 over. Thank you very much indeed. That was speedy but efficient. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. If you could clear the stage so we can move on to plenary session number 2, the path to economic recovery. This is moderated by Géraldine Amiel, Paris Bureau Chief of Bloomberg, and it includes as speakers Valérie Baudouin,